In this lesson, we're going to use the negative exponent rule. Negative exponent rules. In algebra, there is a restriction or rule that says that you cannot leave your answer with a negative exponent. In other words, any number to where you left it with a negative exponent is not a simplified answer. So you have to turn all negative exponents into a positive. And to do so is just simply flipping the number. So if it's a whole number, for example, let's say we have a raised to the negative n power, you have to flip it. So what you can do is write it as over 1, and then the 1 will go on top, and whatever that number was raised to the power will go onto the bottom. And notice once you did that flipping process, notice the exponent is no longer negative, it's a positive. And if you have a fraction, same thing. And you notice that any part of the fraction has a negative exponent, some number other than 0 raised to a negative exponent power, you have to flip it. So whatever that is going to go on top. The 1 is going to go on the bottom. Anytime you have a number with a 1 under the bottom, you just write it as that number itself. You don't need the 1. Let's do some examples and it'll make more sense. So for number 1, you have the whole number of 3, an integer raised to a negative exponent power. You can't keep your answer with a negative exponent. So what you have to do is just write that number, for example, as over 1. And the process is simply to flip it. So any number, as we started with, any whole number by itself, if you want to write it as a fraction, you know that all you have to do is write it over 1. And so now what we're going to do is flip. Whatever's on the bottom goes on top, and whatever's on the top goes on the bottom. Now with that flipping process, once you flip it, the exponent is no longer negative. It then becomes positive. So now what we have is 1 over 3 squared, and we know 3 squared equals 9. So our final answer is 1/9. Now I want to go over all those different scenarios that can be problematic with the negatives out front. Just keep in mind, if it's a regular number with a negative out front, you're negating it. So for example, in the first example, it equals 1/9. So it means if we negate it, the answer is the opposite of 1/9, which would be negative 1/9. But let's go ahead and solve it. Again, the problem here is that negative exponent. And you cannot have a negative exponent as your final answer. So what we have to do is write it over 1. And then we're going to flip it. Whatever's on top goes on the bottom and vice versa. Now notice I still have that negative out front because I already know whatever my answer is, I'm going to negate it. So when we flip it, I'm going to have negative 1 over 3 squared. Notice that the 2 is now positive. 3 squared is 9, so that's going to give me negative 1/9. Next, I have a scenario of negative 3 raised to a negative 2 power. Again, the only problem here is that you have a negative exponent. You cannot have a negative exponent, so you have to flip it. It's going to go on the bottom, and your 1 is going to go on top. Now keep in mind, when you have a number in parentheses, everything is going to go down to the bottom along with that parentheses. So when you flip it, it's going to become 1 over negative 3 squared. Notice the 2 is now positive, so all I need to do is solve it, and that's going to give me a final answer of 1 over 9 because negative 3 squared is 9. Now, if you notice, number 3 is the same as number 4. The only difference is, again, we negated it. So if number 3 we got an answer of 1/9, You should know that number 4 is going to be negative 1/9, but let's go ahead and do the process. Again, we have to flip the fraction because we have to flip the number rather because we have a negative exponent. So when we flip this fraction, 1 is going to go on top, negative 3 squared on the bottom, and that's going to give us negative 1/9. Because you have that negative out front, you are negating your answer. Negative exponent rule. Let's do 3 more examples using the negative exponent rule. Because I want you to be careful, just make sure that you don't just, for example, in this case, 3x to the negative 2, go ahead and flip everything to the bottom and put a 1 up top. That's not going to work. That would be incorrect. And the reason for that is 3 does not have a negative exponent. 3 have an exponent of 1. X, on the other hand, does have a negative exponent. It has a exponent of a negative 2. So the only thing that's going to move here is just the x. You're not going to move the 3. Leave the 3 alone. You only flip terms that have negative exponents. Don't flip them if their term is not, if their exponent is not a negative. So when you flip it, only the x squared goes to the bottom. So your answer is 3 over x squared. Again, 3 did not have a negative exponent, so you don't flip it. For example 2, you have 4, this is the power rule by the way, raised to the negative 2 power, and 5 raised to the negative 2 power. Now the problem here is that both the top and the bottom have negative exponents, which you know you can't have, so you're going to have to flip it. Whatever's on top goes on the bottom, and whatever's on bottom goes on top. That flipping process makes those exponents a positive, so now all we have to do is square these numbers. On top, 5 squared is 25. On the bottom, 4 squared is 16, and your answer is 25 over 16. For the last example, we have 1 raised to the negative 3, and then 4 raised to the negative 3. Again, our exponents are negatives. You can't have negative exponents, so you're going to have to flip them. Whatever's on top goes on the bottom, and whatever's on the bottom goes on top. That flipping process will make those exponents a positive. So now on top we have 4 multiplied 3 times, which is going to give us 64. 3 multiplied 3 times is going to give me 1. And again, we just write it as a number. We don't write the 1 underneath, because 64 divided by 1 equals 64. So the answer to number 3 is just simply 64. Negative exponent rules. Here is a summary of all the rules of exponents. Please be sure to review them and commit them to memory or have them somewhere in your notes, and that way you won't have any problems with the homework or on the test. Good luck.